All right, so I guess take two. Take two. We wanted to do a quick video based on how students should be selecting subjects. They can get more in-depth detail in the few episodes that we're going to be releasing later on that looks at scaling specifically, looks at case studies, looks at examples. Those kind of situations we'll talk about in those future episodes to come. But today we just wanted to make a quick recording based on a summary of how students should be choosing subjects, right? The first thing that students need to think about is obviously the ATAR. So ultimately, what are they working hard for? They're working hard to get the highest possible ATAR so that they have more options to go into university, right? Obviously, the easiest subjects to get the highest ATAR is subjects that scale high, right? Scale high in the terms of their raw mark might scale to a much higher scale mark in terms of the HSC that will correlate to a good ATAR equivalent. Those subjects are your classic Extension 1 math, Extension 2 math, physics, chemistry, and obviously we can probably put language subjects into there, like if it's not your first language, right? Anything like, I don't know, Japanese continuous, Japanese extension, French continuous, French extension, all those kind of stuff. It's as long as you're not learning some sort of heritage language, right? Then they will scale well. Obviously English Advanced and English Extension 1 scales well to an extent. English Extension 2 not as well as Extension 1, like surprisingly. There's a different kind of cutoff mark that you have to reach. And then you have some neutral subjects like the business studies and the geographies. They're a bit more neutral. They won't be considered too hard or too easy, but the scaling isn't the best. And then legal studies, for example, probably falls in that category as well. And then you have like the really bad scaling subjects like the, I don't know, community and family studies, textiles and ancient history. Ancient history is one of the bad ones, etc. Right? So we might put like a full list. Maybe we can include a list, but that's just a summary of the good scaling subjects, the neutral to low scaling subjects. With the higher scaling subjects, the idea is because they're testing your knowledge on the concept as well as your accuracy. If you don't accurately answer the questions correctly for every single question, that's okay because you still demonstrated your knowledge, right? For example, math. You don't have to get the final answer to get 2 out of 3 because you've done enough work to demonstrate that you get what's going on. You just made a human error. Whereas subjects like ancient history, you really need to know the exact stats and the exact information. Like business studies, you have to know what the definition of GST is, as an example, because it's not like up for interpretation. There's a right and there's a wrong answer. However, the forgiveness of making mistakes obviously varies as well. For example, Extension 1 and Extension 2 maths, you don't really need to get a really extravagant mark to get like a good scale mark, which also is a good ATAR equivalent, right? So for example, recently around 60 to 65% in Extension 2, yeah, is already good enough to get to, say, for example, a 88 to 90 scaled HSC mark, right? And that's already an equivalent to around a 99.6, 99.7. Doesn't make sense, ATAR equivalent. So you could technically not even get a band 6 or E4, and you can still get a 99.5, 99.6 contribution, ATAR contribution for the Extension 2 part, which is counted as a 2 in its subject, right? For English, I highly recommend every student to do advanced English. I feel like standard English is a bit of a scam because if you're, let's say for example, you're not the strongest English student, right? The real difference between standard and advanced is not really that extravagant. You still have to do all those modules and you still have the common module, you know what I mean? You still have comprehension, which is unseen, you know what I mean? So it's like a lot of it is already the same, right? But the scaling is significantly better, you know what I mean? So I feel like any student that's considering or being pressured to do standard English should think otherwise. They should probably try to get into advanced. But for students that are doing EALDs, English as a second language, right? I think that's fine. That scaling is as good as advanced English. So if you've been in Australia for 5 years or less, those people should probably pick EALD. They have a much easier time. The content is significantly easier and the scaling is still as good. we're also not saying you shouldn't pick visual arts or design and technology or textiles, right? But if you do pick those subjects, you really need to do well, right? Because it's like you have to show your effort, you have to show your heart, you have to show your soul in mastering the technique of painting or mastering the technique of whatever, you know what I mean, of sewing or whatever. And at the same time, there must be like a big story or a big kind of motivation or inspiration of your piece of work or whatever, right? That's like you're not just wishy-washy making some random fake narrative up, right? And this is also why I personally feel that you should not do any major work subjects. But that's my personal opinion, okay? Things like textiles, things like visual arts, things like English Extension 2, right? I would shy away from any major work subjects. And the reason why is I think to create an art form, you should not be restricted by time because art might take time. Like, for example, the Mona Lisa isn't getting painted in a year, right? Da Vinci just didn't go, oh, it's my HSC year, let me paint the Mona Lisa, right? He might have taken 5-6 years or whatever it was to paint it. So you're at a risk of not creating your most best final piece of work because purely by the restriction of time. And also because of opinion. So the marker that's marking it might not feel so strongly about your personal experiences and therefore might not feel so strongly about your artwork. But you might feel very emotional, very connected to the work that you've done. Does that make sense, right? And you can't let someone else that hasn't experienced your life kind of completely judge you and give you a grade for something that they don't fully understand, isn't it? Now, if you want to treat it as purely an outlet to kind of release all the pressure and stress and concern that you have onto your major work, and that's fine, and you don't really treat it as, you know, like, oh, whether I do well or where I don't do well, it's not going to really affect me in terms of my ATAR because I don't really care too much about the ATAR in that sense. I just care about being heard or, you know what I mean, spending time to do it. Then it's fine, right? But otherwise, then you have low scaling subjects that you just have to do well in, right? If you do well, it's fine. Ancient history, you get like 97, 98%, it's fine. Legal studies, 97, 98%, it's fine. You know what I'm saying? And you might think 97, 98 is really high. It is really high. Like state rank is probably like 98 for some of these subjects, right? But there's no choice. If you want to get a 99 plus ATAR, right, and do med or do law, and you pick ancient history or you pick legal studies, unfortunately you have to get 97, 98 so that your ATAR is 99 plus, if that makes sense, right? Other subjects like business studies, probably in that vicinity, you probably need to get like good raw marks of 90 plus, you know what I mean? Geography too, et cetera, et cetera. So just to finally summarize, high scaling subjects will do well for your ATAR. And then you have the major work subjects like textiles, visual arts, 4-unit extension to English, music. Yeah, that's a major performance, right? I usually try to stay away from those unless you've like been practicing the piano for like 15 years already or something. You know what I mean? You're some sort of prodigy. That's fine. Low scaling subjects, medium to low scaling subjects like the business studies, geographies, and histories, legal studies, all those kind of stuff. Yeah, engineering. Those ones you have to perform really well. If you perform really well, you're really knowledgeable about that stuff. Great, do it because you're probably going to get above 95% raw mark, which is fine, right? If you're going to get like a 70% of those, it's kind of really bad, you know what I mean, in terms of scaling. So try to avoid those subjects if you can't guarantee above 90 raw mark. Yeah, HSC scaling is, so the raw mark that you get, you don't actually know when the HSC results come out. You only get to see the scale mark. And the scale mark for the HSC is just like a generalization in the sense that if I want to compare multiple subjects, you know, of different like departments, right? How do I compare math and English? Well, obviously those marks will need to be scaled to a point in which I can make sense of it. Doesn't make sense. For example, my 80% in English might scale to 85, right? And my 60% math might scale also to 85. Doesn't make sense. Once the HSC scales it, it's kind of like them saying to you that a 60% in math is the same as an 80% in English because they got the same scale mark around 85. But that changes year to year. because it depends on the level of difficulty of the exam that year. You know how every year there's different levels of difficulty, right? So the scaling will vary year to year. But that number is not what's important for the ATAR per se. ATAR, the UAC creates its own scaling, right? To show you kind of like what your cumulative mark out of 500 is, and therefore what kind of ATAR alignment that would be. Let's say, for example, 99.95 is a cumulative mark around 480 out of 500, right? If you divide that by 5, that's about a 96 scaled on average, let's say, for example. I don't know, like just as an example. And then if each of your subjects kind of accumulate to, do you know what I'm saying, that amount around a 480, 470, 480 out of 500, then you're obviously going to get 99.95, you know what I mean? And then obviously the next category will be 99.9 and 99.85 and so on and so forth. So that scaling is done outside of NESA. It's done by the UAC, which creates the ATAR, right? I personally think that scaling is more important to know, because two subjects that you both get band 6 in won't get you the same ATAR equivalent. If they aren't interested in anything but they have talent, they should pick high scaling subjects. If they feel very strongly about a certain subject to a point where they can very confidently get 90+% raw mark, then I think that's okay to pick as well. Also, people that aren't too fussed about getting a really high ATAR, that just want to have a good time, do you know what I'm saying? And like their course is probably only 93, 92 ATAR, you know what I mean? And that's plenty, do you know what I'm saying? I think then it's all right as well. But usually what I like to say is, I don't want the students to aim low. I want them to aim high. Does that make sense?
Just in case.
Yeah, right? So because the higher you aim, the more options and more variety of courses you can pick, right? Because maybe you're only picking 92, 93 ATAR because that's the limit that you put on yourself. You think that's your capability, right? But if you get someone like myself at ProEd or another teacher at ProEd to be able to like look at your work and be like, hey, I think you can achieve much more, then it opens up a lot of possibility and potential for the students. For example, one of the students came to me that's graduating this year, and initially she was like, oh, I'm thinking of picking veterinary studies and UCID, I think it's like a 98 point something. And after I did an ATAR estimate for her, I was like, oh, I think you're in line for like 99.5 plus. And then all of a sudden she's like, oh, really? Okay, well, scratch that. I'm gonna go back home, I'm gonna think about it. And the next week she came back and she was like, oh, I'm trying to aim for med now. Doesn't make sense, because she didn't know that she had the potential of being able to get that, right? So you need someone, a professional, hopefully to be able to identify that you have much more potential that you give yourself credit for, isn't it? But also we have the blueprint to be able to show you how to be able to get that. It's not a luck, it's not a guessing game at the end of the day. We are able to calculate the student's ATAR very accurately, do you know what I'm saying? To let them know what they're aligned for so that they can know how much harder they need to work in order to get to the next ATAR they can possibly get. But also they know what their minimum, like worst case scenario, what kind of ATAR they're getting so that they can also have a backup plan, if that makes sense. Yeah. But other than that, yeah, more answers to come in the future episodes. Anything that we missed, drop it down in the comment section. Cool? All right, that's it.